My name is Andy Kennedy with New Era Partners, and today we're talking about FSMA 204, which is the new traceability rule. Originally signed into law in 2010 and is just now, the final rule was issued in November of 2022 and will be actually enforced in January 20th of 2026. And it covers entities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods on the food traceability list. And it's a record keeping rule, which requires entities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods on the FDL to capture critical tracking events and key data elements. And that information is everything from the farm. So, beginning with harvest and cooling records to initial packing records, shipping records, receiving records, and transformation records. And for wild-caught seafood, also there's a first land-based receiver event for wild-caught. Aquaculture is covered under initial packing, so they're covered. And it also covers shell eggs, fresh produce, aquaculture, as I mentioned, and then a number of processed foods like cheese, nut butters, and so forth. And we can go through that whole list. But the idea is that information, you have certain records you need to keep, and then there's certain information you need to pass to subsequent recipients. So the information, and we'll walk through in detail, so you can see exactly what kind of information needs to be captured and stored. At the base of the rule are these new record keeping requirements. So you have to include or capture the information either on paper records, electronic records, or you can have true copies. So you can, digitally image those records. So you could take a piece of paper and scan it, that's fine, and store the digital image. And if you have electronic links, those have to be good for 2 years, because records have to be kept for 2 years. And they have to be available within 24 hours. And upon request, you may have to generate a sortable spreadsheet. So converting that information into a spreadsheet so FDA can consume it. So this gives you an idea of what the critical tracking events are. So I'm kind of showing a model supply chain and where you need to capture information and what kind of information. So beginning at the grower level is a field map. So like defining the farm address and the name of the farm, and then the fields within that farm. So, and providing names for those fields that can be used by the initial packer to reference for harvesting records. So like it's when you create that harvest record, you really have to know where it was harvested. So you have to have a mechanism for getting back there. The field map provides that mechanism. So you have the geo coordinates where that field is, a field name, and but the initial packer just has to have the field name because the grower has the field map. So harvesting and cooling records are then passed from the harvester and cooler to the initial packer, where they capture all the information about harvesting, cooling, the initial pack location, what product was packed, all the information that a packer normally captures is aggregated at the packer. And then a reference to that called the traceability lot code is then passed from the packer to the next step in the supply chain, whether it be a processor or a distributor. And that traceability lot code is how you identify that food. So, and that's really user defined, but generally the food industry has adopted the GS1 standards. And if you're familiar with case labels from the Produce Traceability Initiative, it's the G10 and lot is the definition of the traceability lot code by a lot of supply chain participants. So shipping information is then passed to the next point in the chain, and that's ship from, ship to, the ship date, bill of lading or packing list number, the product description. So what are you actually shipping? And then, as I mentioned, the traceability lot code, and then the source, traceability lot code source. So where was that packed? So those are some of the KVs that are passed from one to the other. And then the way we maintain traceability through a processor is once you have that traceability lot code for the ingredient that you receive, is connecting that to the product that you produce through a transformation record, where you capture the inputs and you capture the outputs in one record. And that's what connects it at the transformation step. And then it's rinse repeat with shipping and receiving up the supply chain, unless it's transformed again. So, and the point is that traceability lot code remains the same unless it gets transformed. So that way at the restaurant level or retail store, they have the same traceability lot code that the initial packer or processor did. Because it's really frustrating when you're doing a traceback investigation at FDA, if you don't have, who did the packing or processing, how do I get in touch with them? And then if you don't have the original lot code, that's really what those packers and processors need to be able to figure out like which records to look at. So which ingredients did they use? Which farms did it come from? What production line did I run that on? Which day did I run that on? They generally, those processors want to know their lot code. So they want to know the lot code that they assigned during processing. But the way it works today with the BT Act is most of the time the information that's passed up the chain is just the SKU of the purchaser, or it's the PO line item or things like that. And you lose that original manufacturer's lot code in that process. This rule fixes that problem. So it requires whoever's doing the initial packing or processing to assign a lot code, and it requires everyone downstream to use that same lot code to refer to it. So that's kind of how this works. And to give you some examples of how that data actually looks, on the farm location and field map, this is an example of a farm location and field map. So you can see there's the farm and there's the farm address. And then we have the geo coordinates of these different fields. And I've assigned a global location number. I mean, you can assign whatever number you want to keep track of them, but I just create an example with the GS1 keys. So you've identified these fields, and then in your harvest record, this is where you capture, who's going to do the packing and what's the commodity variety, where was the farm, where was the field, and the harvest date and the harvest record information. And then I put in who captured the information and the date. So that's an example harvest record. Then when you get to initial packing, that's where this information gets a little more detailed. So you have the date you received that food from the field, the farm where it was harvested, the field, the business name and phone number of the harvester, the date of harvesting, if it was cooled before initial packing, where was it cooled and when? And then this is the traceability lot code that was assigned. And then the finished product, then the number of cases, and then where did you do that packing and the date and the production order number. And again, who entered that information onto this record. So this could be a paper record, be a digital record. The rule is not specific on how that works. So I'm going to pause here because we've taken it from the overview of the rule all the way into some detailed records. So I imagine you may have questions. Okay, so
I
Anita
have a question.
or McKenna?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Anita,
Yeah,
you can
McKenna.
go.
Thank you. I have a quick question. So for a farm, like the farm would be doing the farm map and this second packing record as well?
Yeah, if you do the packing at the farm level, so if they do the packing and the farming, yeah, then they would have this farm and field map, and then they would capture probably the harvest record, and they would create this initial packing record.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep. McKenna?
Are there exemptions to this?
There are. So for farms below 25,000 And I think for retail stores, restaurants, and processors, below 250,000 annual revenue. They're
And
also,
oh, go ahead.
yeah.
Go
Oh,
ahead. No,
I
you
was
go
gonna
ahead.
say,
Sorry.
there's a bunch of random exemptions, and I can show you that there's kind of a choose your own adventure guide to exemptions
Okay.
that I can show
Perfect.
you. It's a just click through and it'll show you all the exemptions.
Okay. Yeah, that was my other question. If there is any like flow chart or other guidance docs
Absolutely.
floating around out there. Cool.
Yep.
Can I throw something in on that particular back and forth? It didn't come clear to me why we have to do this. And so when we hear, am I exempt? It's because I don't really see why I have to do this.
Mhm.
And FDA's motivation has been the extraordinary amount of lost time and lost health harm done in slow, cumbersome, ineffective, and ultimately damaging to the uninvolved parties that get looped in because they couldn't provide records. So the magic in this, I think, is going to be to find so the exemption from the rule does not exempt us from being part of a traceability investigation. So what we want to do as smaller entities and value chain entities is look at these requirements and say, how can we make them fit our operations as much as possible, exempt or not? Because at the end of the day, if FDA comes calling, business shuts down and does usually not reopen. So there's this balancing act, and this is why I think Phil and I are excited to have Andy come back to us, which is not just bring the rule, but now at some point, hopefully we dig into the practicalities of what would this look like in operations like what Anita says, where multiple functions are occurring at a small entity. How can records be designed that don't cripple the farm, and if anything, add value by demonstrating what we can do for the most vulnerable customer who may be the person getting our food at the end of the chain. Back on mute.
That was awesome. Yeah, and that's, at the end of the day, this is about keeping, consumers healthy. Like the food that they purchase, if there is a problem with it, having the ability to go back and find the source of contamination and rectify it. And there's a lot of talk about recalls, and that's important to get food out of the supply chain. But oftentimes, the way it works right now, it takes a month or more to do a traceback investigation, because instead of having this neat, crisp lot code and the source where it was packed, by the time you get to the end of the supply chain, even the product description changes. So like you have almost no shot in a commodity produce item of getting back to the beginning of the supply chain in anything less than a month. It's just a lot of detective work, and it's very imprecise because it's mostly just text-based descriptions and commercial identifiers, PO line item, invoice, things like that. So it takes a long time. So by that time, all the fresh food that was produced at that location is gone. It's through the supply chain. There's no chance of really recalling it. So that's why recall hasn't been really that impactful, because it takes too long. And then, so their goal is to shrink it from an average of 35 days to an average of 6 days. But the other thing is you can shrink the size of the team that has to do these outbreak investigations. So you increase the capacity, so you get better throughput out of FDA's core team, which means you can discover a lot more problems and rectify them. So that's really the goal. And McKenna, you've got a question?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering a little bit about, like, this totally makes sense for these huge supply chains where everything really takes a long time and there's a lot of different steps in it. But there's so much happening with these shorter supply chains being formed, and it doesn't take a month to do a whole traceability plan. It can take hours if you only have a couple steps in your supply chain. Is there any language around that in this at all? I'm just seeing these requirements, and I feel like so much of it is rolling down onto the farmers to start this process. And if you have a shorter, healthier, well, I shouldn't necessarily say healthier, but if you have a shorter supply chain, it just seems a little different, or maybe it could be a little different.
Yeah, it's certainly easier to implement. If you have a simpler operation and shorter supply chain, it's much, much easier. The larger players, this is actually a challenge, which the fact that it's such a challenge gives you an idea of how little transparency there is through those operations. So if you look at this and you're like, this is pretty easy, I can do this almost today, that's great. And it just means that the lift is going to be a lot less for you. You're right. This is going to fall most heavily on the large distributors, like the massive distributors that do 1,000 to 2,000 pallets a day through their facilities. Because keeping up with all this information at the DC, it's a challenge, and you've got to digitize it. So that means any products coming in have to be electronically shared ahead of time because they need to process those pallets quickly. So it will create, a requirement that information is shared electronically to them just so they can get those pallets in and out fast. Because on the ship receive, you can see what the shipping, it's not a lot of data that ship receive has to do. And ship and receive are basically the same pieces of data, but that traceability lock code that is assigned by the initial packer or processor has to be the same format for everybody because the DCs can't take a zillion different formats. Like their systems can't handle it. So, but with a smaller, shorter supply chain, you can handle a little more flexibility. You have a little bit more leeway in terms of what you can do because the volumes aren't the same. So it actually,
Yeah, that's
yeah. So anyway, that's.
Yeah, it's actually what I was just wondering is like, I'm not looking at this thinking it's going to be easy. I'm looking at it, it's going to be really hard for all the different vendors. And just thinking for a shorter supply chain, like we can do a recall in 30 minutes. But anyways, I have a lot to learn about this. So
yeah, recalls really aren't as big a problem. It's the investigations going backwards down the supply chain.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, when I was at FDA, we would have to go down simultaneously 4 or 5 different supply chains. And if the data is all in different formats at every point in the supply chain, piecing it together is a challenge. So, Rochelle, I saw you had your hand up.
I did. I'm just trying to make some sense out of this. Are these, so they say that they're examples, but are they formatted somewhere? Like, are they templates that we could utilize? And where exactly does the traceability lock code come from? Does that something that just each individual, the beginning makes up that number and we just need to have the consistency and follow through throughout the rest? Or is it actually generated by the NFP or the FSMA so that it's more generalized and or more specified so that it's all continuity and uniform?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the generation of the lock code, there are best practices for different commodity groups for how to do that. So, for example, the Produce Traceability Initiative has a best practice for how to assign the traceability lock code. They also have a best practice for the electronic sortable spreadsheets, which will kind of give you a template for what these records look like. And I can walk you through those, and I can bring that website up and kind of walk you through those as an example. You don't have to do that, but it's definitely, for the high volume produce industry, that's going to be kind of how they assign it. And they use the GS1 standards that have been around for, the Produce Traceability Initiative was started in 2007. So it's been around for a while. It's basically leveraging off the standards that have been developed under that protocol. So, and I can put a link in the chat to some of the resources, and then we can go deeper dive into it in a second. So that's PTI stuff. And then in terms of the rule itself, we'll also go through that website, and I'll post that in the chat. So you've got that. And then the short version of the rule, which is here. is there. So you've got the resources. Yeah, so this is a shipping record. So basically that traceability lot code, that GS1 global trade item number, which is based on a prefix that is purchased from GS1. And then you can assign those numbers, and then you attach a product description to that G10. So in this case, romaine lettuce hearts. And then the 10 is the lot code. And that's just your internally assigned lot code. And that's how you differentiate between, different days, different locations. And it's just your normal lot code assignment process. Those two pieces together make the traceability lot code. And then you have the basic commercial information, like the quantity and unit measure, the ship from, ship to, ship date, and then reference document like the bill of lading. But we also, ask for the source. So where was this actually produced? So you can do global location number, you can do your FDA facility registration number, you could do a URL that points to that physical location. You can do whatever you want in terms of how you want to point that. But the main point is that FDA has the ability to get to that location and ask for the records. So there's a bunch of different ways you can do it. You can pass it as a kind of a private data sharing mechanism to FDA, or it can be public information. It's really up to you. So that's shipping, and then receiving. So the subsequent recipient, the people that get it, they record basically the same information. The only difference being it's the receive date as opposed to ship date. And then for the reference document number, it may be a different document based on, it could be your own PO or your own receive information.
Andy, I had a quick question.
Mhm.
Actually, just a quick comment. Teresa had posted earlier in the chat that her take was that many farms are already collecting this info, but probably not in the same format. And I think that's probably pretty accurate, especially if they've gone through any kind of food safety training or even certification. They're probably already having a lot of this kind of stuff. And it's funny, as you're talking, my background before working in food was working in medical devices. And right as the time was out that I was leaving that industry, that was when FDA was rolling out their unique device identification initiative, which is very similar, where the issue they were running into is that a lot of different medical devices, there was no standardization across the like their product numbers.
Mhm.
You could have the same product number that would reference a dozen different things across a dozen different companies. So they implemented this unique device identification that is the same thing as that G10 and lot, so that that number would correspond to only one product at only one organization. So is FDA thinking along the same lines um, for the food side of things too? Like, is there going to be a push towards the standardization of that traceability lot code, or is it still kind of like whatever you want, but as long as it stays consistent throughout the supply chain?
Yeah, so the FDA was somewhat hamstrung in terms of how specific they could be. But you're exactly right. On the drug and device side, they use the GS1 standards to create the UDI, and they so it's basically the same precursor piece, which is the G10. But with those devices, they had a serial number. So each and every item had a unique ID. And then within the food industry, people do things in batch lots, not serialized. So it's slightly different. So it's G10 plus lot, but it's the same root. It's the same base as that GS1 prefix and the G10. And Congress said FDA could not pick one technology or force the adoption of any particular technology in the creation of the rule. So they couldn't pick the GS1 standards that you absolutely have to do that. But the way they wrote the rule is to accommodate the usage of it. So that is a perfectly acceptable solve for the traceability lot code. And then from a technology perspective, on the receiving side, when they get the sortable spreadsheets, when they do data requests, they're prepared to handle that G10 lot from industry, and they're looking at the best practices that industry are developing for sortable spreadsheets and using those as reference as they're developing the receiving technology. So if you use one of those templates, they would be able to handle it. So I think that's about as close as they can get to an endorsement of a particular technology, is to say, look, if you use these templates, you can submit them and we can process them directly. So, but yeah, it was a challenge. Yeah, Congress set up like these little gates, like a downhill ski run, like a slalom ski run. So they set up all these little gates, like things you can't do and things you have to do. And then, the rule writing team, we had to go through these different gates and figure out how to get the rule written, but also not violate the law. So it was kind of a challenge, and that was one of them. So I'm gonna stop sharing this and then flip over to the best practices so you can see that. Because that's these are a big help, the best practice guides. So this is the Produce Traceability Initiative best practice website. So under resources and tools, this has how to do the harmonized case label. So that's right here. And this provides information on best practices for how to put together this case label. And this will be updated somewhat, to conform with FSMA 204, like this responsible party down here, instead of just being a general brand owner, this will have to be more specific, like where this was actually packed. But the G10 is here, the 01, and then that 14-digit number, and then the lot code is after the 10. So this is how you put that G10 and lot together. So this is essentially that license plate for the product as it moves through the supply chain. People can capture that traceability lot code from this barcode. So that was the idea. So that's kind of the labeling best practice. And then underneath here, under guides, this is where the electronic sortable spreadsheets are. So you can look at different points in the supply chain and take a look at some of these electronic sortable spreadsheets. So if FDA asks for the data, this is the format that's recommended anyway. And they put the specific fields like GTIN, batch, date code, pallet ID, quantity unit measure, the ship to, the ship from, things like that in the sortable spreadsheet. So this gives you an idea of what that spreadsheet would look like. And then there's one for harvest, cooler, initial packer, and transformer. Then there's one for receiver, shipper, final distributor, retail store, and food service operations. Then there's additional guidance from GS1 on FSMA 204. So this link will take you to that guidance document, which will give you a little bit more detailed information about FSMA 204 and resources available. So that's kind of the PTI side. And from an FDA side, they've put together a whole website on FSMA final rule. And they have great resources in here. So this is the short version of the rule. This is the long version of the rule. And then they have things like the compliance date, getting started with the traceability rule, and it kind of walks you through the different steps. So which exemptions apply, what critical tracking events and key data elements do you need to maintain, developing your traceability plan, and what's on the food traceability list. So this has the whole food traceability list. So what's covered, your cheeses and your shell eggs and nut butters and produce items and fresh cut and finned fish and smoked finned fish and crustaceans and ready to eat deli salads. So, which was a random one. But this gives you the list of like what's covered. And then in terms of the KDs and CTs, when you click this, it gives you a little guide, which you can click on each critical tracking event and it'll tell you what data you need to collect from each. So like we were just talking about initial packing, it lists that information, shipping and receiving, and then transformation, and then traceability plan. So this is really where you kind of need to get started. First is working on your traceability plan. So your procedures for maintaining the records, including your format, where you're going to store them. And then how do you identify foods on the FTL that you manufacture, process, pack, or hold? And then how do you assign traceability lock codes if you're a processor? And then identifying a contact person within your operation. And this is that field map, the farm map that I was talking about for produce and aquaculture. And then you've got to keep your traceability plan for 2 years and update it periodically as things change. So that's really your first step. And then, working out these procedures on how you're going to collect this information, where you're going to store it for 2 years, and how can you produce a sortable spreadsheet when you need to. So that's like the quick and dirty KDE guide. And then under the exemptions, this is where where's Waldo. So you start here and it answers a sequence of questions. And this will tell you, if you're a retail food establishment, so with an average annual monetary value of food sold over previous 3-year period of no more than 250,000, say yes, then you're not subject to the rule. So that's kind of how this works. So then you can pick your start, and this will answer your questions about like farm size and things like that. Then let's see, additional information. You've got like supply chain examples. So they put together different examples of produce and seafood and cheese and deli salads. So you can go look at the slides. They've got a video presentation for a lot of them. So you can go look at like the produce supply chain slides. And this will kind of explain the journey of cucumbers. And there's a great video track that goes with this as well that explains it. So there's that. And then FAQs are available. So there's a bunch of frequently asked questions that show up. So those are all available here about, I mentioned cross-docking, transformation, initial packer, the product tracing system that FDA is working on, your traceability plan. So it's got all these, kind of question and answer format, which is really helpful. So in terms of guidance, there's a small entity compliance guide that is super useful. So you can download this small entity compliance guide, and this will provide, kind of a summary of the rule and kind of walk you through it. So things like who's subject to the rule, what is the food traceability list. So this has a lot of that information in here about the exemptions and so forth. So there's the traceability plan and information about it, and then records of critical tracking events. And this kind of explains what you have to do for each critical tracking event. Then if you got 4 hours to kill, they did a whole webinar at FDA on the food traceability rule. So this goes in depth and provides like a full webinar explaining the rule. So if you want more detailed information, that's available. And then under additional information, there's a bunch more specific information about retail food establishments, and the risk ranking model, if you want to see like how foods ended up on the list, that's all out there. And then additional information here. So, and if you get confused and have a question, you can do a meeting request with FDA and actually ask them detailed questions in person, or you can submit a question through the Technical Assistance Network. So under the frequently asked questions, you can submit a question from this to the TAN. So right there's the Technical Assistance Network. And then you can submit your question either online or mail it or email it. So there's a bunch of different ways to submit your question. And they're pretty good. They'll get back to you in a couple weeks, usually. Okay, so that's kind of the resources from FDA. These are the PTI resources. And, you know, as I showed, there's the GS1 resources. So those are some of the resources that are out there for the rule. So I'm going to take a pause because that's kind of a ton of information. And I see there's like some things in the chat. So, and I can put this link out there so you've got it. All right. Cool. Okay, so I've sandblasted you with a bunch of links and a bunch of clicks. So what questions do you have, and how else can I be of help?
One question I had is, are there organizations out there that are working to roll this information out to like groups of farmers, or if it's like, hey, I want somebody to come talk to my group of local farmers about this and what they have to do, and have a workshop like that? Are there organizations doing that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think within each commodity group, they're like, you know, doing commodity specific guidance. And I've seen some of you know, different like trade associations have been doing education. So I've seen it at that level. I think like ag extension, like moving it out to ag extension, I think that's the next step for FDA to actually invest in the training resources to get this pushed out to ag extension and move out in that direction. But I don't think they've developed the resources because the rule's so new. So it's less than a year out. So I think they're kind of letting some of the industry best practices settle out before they actually start rolling out, you know, industry guidance, is my sense. McKenna?
I actually have two questions.
Mhm.
My first question is, so if you are, so say you are not exempt, so I'm not exempt as a distributor, but I am selling product from someone who is exempt. Do you know how that comes into play?
Yeah, so if you receive product from someone who's exempt, then it's your responsibility to assign the traceability lot code and capture some information about them.
Okay.
And that's covered, you know, if you look at that Katie click-through diagram, it will explain what to do if you're getting it from someone who's exempt. Yeah.
And then kind of along that thread, like if you're selling product from someone who should be doing this but isn't doing this because they haven't done it yet, is that the same answer that you're, but like if it gets to you and there isn't a code, you need to make one?
Yeah, that's a challenge. So it's hard to know if the person you're getting the food from is exempt for real, or they just don't want to do it.
Right.
So I think that's really, it's kind
Or
of
they're
up
just
to
straight
you.
up don't want to, they're not doing it. Like they're just
Oh,
out of
yeah.
compliance.
Yeah. And so I think the way to think about it is when you set up your purchase agreements with people, make sure to include that in your purchase agreement, that if you're covered by the rule, and, you know, make them aware of the rule, A, and then if you're covered by the rule, these are the things you need to send us. So it's required that shippers provide those key data elements to receivers. So that is actually a requirement in the rule, which is different than the old traceability rule, which each entity was on their own for like what data they had to collect. Now you're actually required to provide the information to the subsequent recipient. So you can actually write it in your purchase agreement that you have to be in conformance with FSMA 204 if you're covered and you're selling a food on the food traceability list. So if the food's covered and you're covered, you have to provide us with the shipping KDs, and you can be specific and say, this is the way I want to get them. You know, is it like packing lists and case labels? Is it an electronic file? Is it, you know, through a system? Like you can be fairly prescriptive if you write it into your purchase agreement, because they don't have to accept the purchase agreement. You know, they don't have to take your PO and fulfill it. So that's kind of your one leverage point, is when you place that order. Then you can include in your paperwork, this is exactly how you want that to work. And then you can reject it. Like if you get it and it doesn't conform to your PO, you can push it back.
But what if you don't want to reject it? Like, can you, like, I'm just kind of playing a little devil's advocate. Like, we need this product. It's a farm that's really important. They're not in compliance. We as a distributor are in compliance.
Yeah, I mean, you can ask them, you can verbally like call them and say, hey, what's the lot code of this product? And then you can add it, or you can generate one for yourself. Then you become the traceability lot code source and you could capture the information. And then I would document it as a corrective action. So I would, you know, it's just like any other supplier non-conformance. If they use the wrong boxes or the quality was garbage or whatever, just treat it as a corrective action. And then if it happens like a ridiculous number of times from that supplier, you may elect to either work with them to fix the problem or just find a different supplier. So it's just like any other quality issue, really.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yep. Steve?
I'm thinking that in our short, generally less complicated value chains, the key conversations are going to begin with the buyers, because the buyers are going to be they're not going to be suddenly closing the door on their broadliners and buying all their food from us and following our simplified systems. We're going to be fitting into the buyer's new responsibilities, because trace back investigations usually start at the place where the food was eaten or bought. Okay, so when we think about the value we bring to the trace, the investigation world, it would be having quicker, better answers, and also having our buyers be able to get them to the investigators. So what we got to do, and we know that from our experience with our buyers, all buyers, anything we do to make their job harder is less likely to happen. Anything we do to make their job easier is very likely to happen. So I think in our value chains, where we're integrating at certain points with more conventional supply chains, we're looking at how can we fit into the needs of that buyer in the event that they get the call. And I do think, McKenna, the questions that you were asking and hearing, you and Andy go back and forth on, well, what do we do when we have a supplier who really matters? There are ways that at whatever point we realize that a non-compliance has occurred, we can take, so to speak, ownership of it at that point, and then we work our way backwards to try and correct it. But I think the key is to design stuff based on what would help buyers respond in the event they were asked, and that it wouldn't ripple through our system and create chaos. And what you heard, I like the question. Well, we're covered, but what if we buy from someone who's exempt? Well, you can't waive compliant operation fairy dust over a non-compliant product and have it become compliant. The responsibility sits with you. What to do with that responsibility? There are a number of options, and I figure that with all this work, all the farm to school stuff, the local food purchase agreement stuff, the local farm to all these new value chains that are being created, the thing we have to keep foremost in our mind is what happens at the end of that chain when the call comes that says we have PulseNet identified 2 illnesses at such and such, and we're concerned that it may have passed through you. hopefully I make that point mainly for us as middle of supply chain hubs and value chain coordinators to talk about how do we make the bridges between our buyers and their needs and our producers and what works at the producer level.
And I think you're exactly right, because if you make your customer's life easy, that they're going to come back to you and want more product, because this can be a differentiator. The people that get out in front of this, they're going to be really well positioned to capture more market share, because they're going to have it buttoned up. And like I said, the bigger operations, this is a lot harder actually for the bigger operations, because they have so much complexity. So it really it's a good opportunity for smaller operations that have simpler data management challenges. So everyone's going to have trouble. Like, don't get me wrong, everyone's going to have trouble. But the really big ones that have many legacy systems from all kinds of purchases and acquisitions and growth and so forth, the data integration of those systems is hard. So they have to solve that problem, and then they have to solve the 204 problem. So yeah. And in terms of technical assistance for food hubs and operations that are kind of coming under this rule that maybe haven't been as aware, I think you're exactly right. I think targeted messaging, targeted training, targeted comms for the food hubs to say this is like how to actually do it as a food hub makes a ton of sense. And I just, this infographic that I've got up here, learn, plan, do, review, it's a free infographic. I just put the link to it. So that at least gives people kind of a starting point in terms of thinking about where they are in the journey. And then we have kind of an ebook on how to read the rule. So, but I think creating more tailored guidance for food hubs would be a really terrific idea. So and I was going to mention, I'm in Hawaii randomly. So in November 13th through the 18th, I'm going to be in the Western Growers has their annual meeting at the Grand Hyatt in Kauai. So I'll be there for that week. So I don't know if anyone wants to look me up, that's where I'll be for that week. And if you want to do an in-person data sharing, I'm more than happy to do that. Cool, Lisa. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll send you my contact details and along with the deck, that I've put together. So I'll push that out to everybody. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. And we'll share the slides and the recording link on the Food Systems Leadership Network as well, for folks that weren't able to make it today. This is great. Do you have any more slides to go through, Andy, or? Yeah,
I put together a quick, rule in brief. So you can click on these and it takes you to the codified. And then there's the FSMA 204 standard. So that's in the deck. So that's a nice quick resource to everything. And then, our parent company, iFoodDS, would murder me if I didn't do the advertisement. So if you do need a technology solution, our parent company is more than happy to help. We've got a partnership with IBM and putting together iFoodDS and IBM Food Trust to create a new application called Trace Exchange, which is a little bit more, it's really designed to do all the things on FSMA 204, but doing it in a more user-friendly way, like with mobile applications and a little less intense in terms of the requirements. So HarvestMark, which is part of iFoodDS, has been doing, PTI case labeling and traceability for 12, 13 years. So they have mobile applications that can help with the receive, the ship, the transform, the labeling, all that kind of stuff, and interface it to the IBM backend. So you have that 2-year data store, and guaranteed to be in compliance with the rule. That's going to be the, part of the value prop, is keeping up with the standards and making sure it's in compliance with the rule. So that's our little, advertisement. So, Phil, I was brought to you today by iFood Trace Exchange. So there you go. So yeah. So if anyone wants to see any more on that, please, again, reach out and we can walk people through that. But it may be an effective tool for you folks. So that is pretty much it. I've got my contact information, and I'll send that out. So you've got all of that. And I love doing this presentation and going through it and explaining the rule in person, over the web. So if you have like food hubs, we've got, I've worked with food hubs in different scales and different levels. So yeah, I'm more than happy to work with you guys in any way, shape, or form that would be useful.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was a lot of really, really good, useful, and actionable information. So this meeting runs till 2:30, so we have time for more Q&A if anybody has any burning questions they want to get off right now.
I have a question not related to this. Can I ask it?
You can ask any question you want.
Okay. So in the realm of other fun new regulations coming down the pipeline, the organic regulations coming into effect in March, and I'm wondering if there's any other distribution aggregation only food hubs that have an organic handling plan that I could look at out there in the universe of food hubs being regulated in March.
That might be a good question to post in the food hub discussion group on FSLN.
Okay. I think I did. Maybe I posted in a different forum. I can't keep it straight. Okay.
Come through, yeah. I don't know.
All right. Well, there you have it. If you ever hear of somebody with them, send them my way.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts for the good of the order?
Real quick, McKenna, I don't know if you posted it here, but I just put the Google group listserv for food hubs, which is kind of gone dormant for a while, but recently has had a lot of action on it. I'm not sure if that's where you posted it or not, but that probably would get the most traction from other hubs.
Yeah, I think it is, but I didn't specifically ask about if anyone has a current plan. So I will spam everyone again.
Okay. Last from me, this is just the last time that I will make this plug, but we sent out a super simple, and I mean super simple, I mean super duper simple little survey to this community of practice, just as we try and figure out what's going to happen for the next actual decade of these meetings. It probably takes less than 2 minutes to fill it out. It's helpful for the Wallace Center reporting to our funders, which we're able to make this possible for the last 3 years. So if you've gotten anything out of these calls or out of this community practice, if you'll give 2 minutes of your time back, it would be greatly appreciated. We do need this done like within the next 2 days. So if you have time at the end of this call, it would mean a lot to me.
Do the survey if you have not done it already. It is very, very short. Anything else? Our last 10 minutes of time together.
I'm curious, now that people have had a chance to kind of absorb it, reactions and thoughts and kind of heard one good suggestion that it would be really, really good to have food hub specific information guidance. If there's anything else that I can take back, from your impression of this, that would be great. It would be super helpful for me as I prepare future presentations.
You know, one thought I had is if there were guides developed that would help, especially farms, not transition, that's not the right word, but the basically, if you are, say you're already GAP certified, you're already harmonized GAP certified, a guide that would say, here's all the things that are needed from 204, and here's where you already have that data. And here are the couple of things that you might have to do just to like bring the stuff you're already doing through your harmonized GAP certification into 204 compliance. So then that feels much less overwhelming to a farm. Where it's like, oh, I already have to do these, I just have to format it a different way. You know, that's not a big deal. That kind of stuff I think would be helpful.
Yeah, that's great feedback. So communicate, especially if you're organic, you're already doing a lot of traceability, or you're GAP certified, you've already gone through the process. You probably have a lot of these records already, and it's just what we found was everyone does it slightly differently, and the point of the rule is to say, right, these are the minimum pieces of information you need to have. So it's actually almost, it's cuts down the work for a lot of people because they were collecting way more information, not knowing what FDA actually wanted. So it actually reduces the volume of information in some cases. So I think, to your point, that would be really helpful to say, all right, these are all the things you have. Let's cross-reference them to the rule, and now you've got, you know, the short version of what you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we have a hand up from Lindsay.
Yeah. So in all of the development of this, was any thought given to plain sect farmers, Amish, Mennonite, etc., who do not use technology?
Absolutely, which is why, you know, one of the requirements is that it you don't have to store records digitally. So handwritten records, totally fine. And in the case of the electronic sortable spreadsheet, if for whatever reason, you know, that doesn't fall within your beliefs or your capabilities, they are more than happy just to take the original records. And FDA will make an exception for anyone really that has a reason why they can't do that electronic sortable spreadsheet. So in this case, you know, the Amish would be exempt. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So there is an exemption for that. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and they're pretty flexible too. So they say 24 hours, but it's 24 hours or an agreed upon time mutually between FDA and you know, the party that is asked or being asked to provide the data. So typically the way it really works in practice is FDA will get on the call, you know, or they'll send someone in person to work with whatever operation, restaurant, processor, retailer. They'll talk with them and say, okay, this is the information we're looking for. What do you have? You know, what can you provide us, and what realistic time frame? Because every outbreak investigation is different, and some of the information is not covered by the rule. So like there's foods that are not on the rule that will be part of an investigation. There's additional records that may be helpful for the outbreak investigation that are not required. So it's really a conversation about, this is all the information we would ideally need, and how long would it take to pull this together, and what's a realistic target? So that's kind of a conversation. It's not as black and white as the rule makes it sound. There's definitely, you know, like for example, a big part of outbreak investigations are loyalty cards. So like that's a huge critical piece of information when someone gets sick, is what did they actually buy at that grocery store? Well, loyalty cards and that information is not required by the rule. So that's a voluntary piece of information that's provided by the consumer and the retail store together. So again, that's non-required, but it is a really important piece of data to start from. So that's why I said it's a negotiation, because there's some information that's required, some information that's not.
The other thing that besides the sortable spreadsheet is the GLN,
Mhm.
you know, is that an absolute requirement?
Nope, absolutely
Okay.
not. So that's just a industry mechanism that's, kind of requested in the, as the industry thought out how to best implement it. It just makes life easy for large databases, but absolutely not a requirement, especially small operations that don't see any value in it.
Right.
Lisa?
Okay.
Thanks, Andy. I just wanted to throw up a suggestion kind of along the lines of what Phil was saying, which is that for those of us who are sort of providing technical guidance to farmers and maybe food hubs, giving example scenarios in a guide would be very helpful. The Harmonized Gap Auditor's Manual provides that, and it kind of lays out an example, like you're in an audit, this is what happens, this would be the finding, this is why. Something like that would be extremely helpful to understanding how the rule is applied in a real life situation and what to look for.
That's great. Yeah, we have even like contemplated videos may be helpful to show real life situations, like walk through all the steps in the process, show each data collection point, how that is actually done in real life.
For sure. Anything else in the last couple of minutes? All right. Seeing none. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Andy. This was wonderful. And best of luck, Elizabeth, on your next stage of your journey. Don't be a stranger. And then, yeah, our next meeting is on December 6th. Same bat time, same bat channel.